Thank you. My pleasure to be here tonight. I'll be talking about manufacturing in China, some of the different aspects of it, some things that I've seen over the past 7 years. It will cover smartphones to some extent, but also other manufacturing practices. As we go through, if you have questions, we can ask them as you go through, and then there'll be a period at the end. We have a video about halfway through, so you can actually get a little bit of a visual about one of Motorola factory in Tianjin. About 10,000 people work there building smartphones. So with no further ado here, let me get started. Okay, so a couple things I want to maybe associate together. So we've got iPods, or your iPhone 4, I think, is their latest announcement. Hopefully no one was in line for that over the weekend, but possibly. City of Long Beach, which has about 400,000 people. Droid Bionic is currently in the market, and Razer just got announced yesterday. And Henry Ford. So what do all these things have in common? Well, Henry Ford is a person who really was a key in manufacturing in America, or actually in the world, and really came up with the assembly line process, or popularized it. Second, China is one of the big glues here. China actually surpassed the US in the last year as the largest manufacturer in the world from a country of origin standpoint. The city of Long Beach, which is pretty local here, has 400,000 people, I think, roughly, last census. That's roughly the same number of people that live in one factory in China, the Foxconn Shenzhen factory. So one factory, 400,000 plus people at that one site. So they have about the same population as the city of Long Beach. That does happen to be the largest single manufacturer as a company in China. And fourth, how do all these things link together? Many of the consumer products that you might have in your pocket, on your hip, they come from China. So many of the Apple products are produced at one of the at a China factory. Foxconn is actually one of their biggest suppliers. Many of the Motorola products have subcomponents or final assembly in China. So it's a very important place in terms of where electronics, high-end electronics, are made in the world today. Why are all these companies doing manufacturing in China? So why are they doing it in the first place? Talk about who does the work. Who actually is building all these phones, all these devices? Where is international manufacturing heading? So everybody knows about China, but is China the end destination, or is that a stop along the route? You hear every so often about quality problems from China. So lead-based paint was in the news, let's say, a year ago, 10 or 15 years ago, well, maybe call it 20 years ago. Actually, China was synonymous with bad quality. That's not true today anymore. It's more of an exception. And then last is, will China remain the go-to spot for manufacturing? Okay, so why are people in China? There's a lot of different equations, but we're in a free market. So, we as consumers, you as consumers, you watch your pocketbook, right? So you want a good product, best price, good features. Well, number one is all these things have to be put together. And what does it cost to put a phone, a DVR, right? A computer, high-def TV. What's the difference in labor prices? Well, in the US, loaded labor, so that's not what somebody sees in their paycheck, but what the company pays, right? So for what they pay plus medical benefits plus 401k matching plus et cetera. So that's a loaded cost. So $33 an hour is, I think that's a 2009 labor figure from the US Department of Labor. That compares to $1.36 an hour for China. It's a little higher than that in China now. It's been going up a little bit, but that's the comparable rate for that time period. Now, one of the things that offsets, so that favors China clearly. One of the offsets is freight. So if you build all this stuff in China, China's pretty far away. It's about a 3-week boat trip. It's much faster on a plane, but planes are a little more expensive. It costs about $8.50 per pound to ship things by air. Local freight's about even. Material costs, so all these things have to be made up of things. So a phone is made up of, has a piece of glass in it, has computer chips, has PC boards, has connectors, has a bunch of different components in it. Material costs will vary, but China has accumulated over the last 15 to 20 years, most of the electronic components are locally sourced in China. So ICs are made in China. A lot of the PC boards are made in China. Castings, heavy machinery are also made there. So a lot of the advantage actually is with parts in China. One of the things that drives the equation back the other way, though, is inventory and response time. So if you have, again, it's cheaper to put it on a boat, but you have to know your demand at least 3 to 5 weeks in advance, so people have to know what they're going to order, at least on an aggregate level. And so that lead time actually works against China manufacturing. So if you have to have a very responsive supply chain, if demand changes very rapidly, or your inventory is very expensive or perishable, that is one of the equations that would work back relative to selling in a US market, would work back the other way. So those are some of the major variables that push and pull whether you build in China or in the US or in the Americas. To give some examples, and these are, so phones, for example, are primarily built in China, at least from my example, and they're generally shipped in by air. Now that does cost a little more, but a phone is relatively light. You can stack a lot of phones in boxes, so they're pretty easy to pack in pretty tight. They're not that heavy. So, and the demand is there's a high amount of demand variance. So phones don't live very long. So the average life cycle of a phone is maybe 9 months. So by the time, from when you launch it, so the Razr launch or the i4 phone launch to when they stop selling it is less than a year. That whole life cycle of that product probably won't last a year. It might last a year, but on average it's about 9 months today. So pretty fast. Set-top boxes, so something your cable provider, if you have cable, would put in a house. Those tend to get put on a boat. The demand isn't as erratic. You can predict it a little better. So they save the money. It's a little bigger, right? So it's kind of a little bigger than a toaster size, so it's a little heavier. Then we also have, kind of shown on the bottom here, there's some, Motorola also builds some pretty big heavy infrastructure things. So something about the size of this podium, a lot of electronic cards in it. That's one of the devices that makes all the set-top boxes able to work and talk to satellites, etc. Since those are big and heavy, those actually get made in Mexico and shipped up. So not everything gets made in China. There's equations that work outside of China. Okay, so who does the work? I try to pick some Loyola Marymount examples, so hopefully these tie in here. But if you look at who are the people in China, actually they are people that would be pretty much ages of people at Loyola Marymount here. So you'll see people in the 18, a lot of the workers are going to be in the 18 to 20-year-old. There's, you know, a tail that are going to be the more technical managers are going to be a little older. But the vast majority of the workforce is kind of in the 18 to 22. You have a nice, beautiful campus here. Factories are built on campuses. So people that are in the factories, they live on site. So they have dorms, right? So I guess that was one of your stock dorm photos. I don't know how many look like that. But that's a China-based one. So you might have 4, 6, 8 people in a dorm, but they have dorms. What I wanted to show you next was a video. What this video is going to show is, these are kind of highlight clips. This is a manufacturing facility. It's located in Tianjin. If you don't know where that is, Tianjin is it is an exciting 2-hour car ride from Beijing, mostly east. It's exciting because there's all sorts of large trucks kind of whizzing back and forth. The rules of the road are more advisory in China than rules. So if you ever get a chance to go there, you may get to experience that for yourself. This is site, again, so had about 100,000 people. Motorola's been there for about 30 years. It's where we make the majority of our smartphones. And you'll see here some of the assembly lines, smartphones being made. You just kind of get an overall impression of it. A lot of things kind of blurred through there real quickly, but let me maybe talk you through a couple of the highlights. So early on in the video, you saw a bunch of big pieces of equipment, look kind of fancy as they were kind of at the start of it. So that was manufacturing equipment. So you have surface mount assembly lines. They showed phones kind of coming down an assembly line. They had this little quick with somebody dropping it. That was part of the what that was actually showing. Every phone is actually drop tested, at least a small distance, to make sure that it works after you drop it. They're all designed to be dropped and still keep working. So that was actually an example of that showing that was actually part of the test cycle. A couple other clips in there. They had that nice little green hand. So environmental compliance and green initiatives are an important part of manufacturing today. I'm sure this is as true for other companies as it is for Motorola. But recycling of things like batteries, PC boards, cardboard reduction, cardboard recycling is an important factor in manufacturing. So that's something, so where you see the little green symbols, that's true both at a product and within a manufacturing environment. That's important. You saw some big team photos. You saw something, you might have seen a TFE showcase type thing. What that is, TFE on our side is Teaming for Excellence. So that is where a group of workers will get together and do a improvement project, either improving costs, cycle time, etc. Those things actually get from a local team in China, but that will get elevated all the way up to a senior management VP level as they kind of go up. It gets escalated depending on the nature of project. He actually, our CEO, Sanjay Jha, was actually in one of the clips. You saw that was one of the people in pink. The little pink outfits that they were wearing, there were some kind of cool pink and blue kind of jumpers. Those are ESD suits. So when you build things, electrostatic discharge. So like if when you walk across a carpet and touch someone and zap them, that's electrostatic discharge. That will blow up your phone before it gets put in a shell and gets grounded and everything. So everybody in a factory that are actually in the assembly line get a little cool hat, plastic or grounded case. So just a couple little highlights out of the video there. Okay, what I wanted to start moving on to next was, where is manufacturing in China going? Over the last, say, 3 years, probably in particular, wages in China have been, relatively speaking, skyrocketing. So especially along the coast, where all the heavy population centers are, a lot of the heavy manufacturing, 14% annual cost wage increases have been occurring. It's been going up pretty quickly. The government is also a factor in this. The Chinese government they've been setting or moving zones, economic incentive zones, and they're starting to reshuffle what they want in certain places. So there are some places, Shenzhen is one of them, where they're trying to develop more financial and other industries or other technology centers and be less manufacturing oriented. They still want to do the manufacturing, just not there. So they're moving some of those economic areas. And then third, one of the things that we've seen, so I gave you that example of the 400,000 person factory. There's certain diseconomies of scale that occur when you're trying to manage 400,000 people. So at any given time, you probably need to be hiring 4,000 to 6,000 people probably a week, just with if you think about a 1% turnover rate. That's a huge amount of staffing to have to go find, and it was probably going to be hard to do in your local area. So as you get into these really large scales, they start seeing problems and additional layers and costs that they're occurring. One of the big issues that they had was actually last year is they had people jumping off of buildings. I mean, it was in the news. You guys might have seen it. As relative to the percentage of people they have, the rate is actually below the U.S. rate. I mean, it's not a good situation, but the fact that it occurred at one factory and it was several people, that hit the news. I mean, that hit the news in the U.S., not just the China news, but that made it back into the U.S. news. And that's a problem. So they had to do a lot of things about that. But managing that many people can be a problem if you're trying to do it all at one site. So what's happening because of that? This particular site has actually started to disassemble. So from a Motorola perspective, one of the moves that we're looking at right now is moving a large portfolio of products to a city called Nanning. There's a lot of, interestingly enough, there's probably a dozen cities you've never heard of in China that have 3 to 5 million people in it. Hangzhou, Nanning, Tianjin are all second-tier cities from a population standpoint, but those are those are 3 to 5 million people in cities that size. Nanning's actually not far from Vietnam, but one of the reasons for the move, right? So the diseconomies of scale, so they don't want to have that many people in one site. The wages are going up on the coast. It's cheaper inland still. And then the government has incentives in this new area to do manufacturing. This is not unique. There's other places, Wuhan, etc., that are going through a similar activity. If you have to move a factory, so moving a factory is not a trivial task, if you haven't had much experience, but just to move the products lines that we're moving right now, the company that we're working with, they have to go hire 2,500 people, like right now, next couple weeks. Before we're gonna let them move a couple hundred different SKUs, so product lines, they're gonna have to build safety stock. So they're gonna have to build ahead in the old factory before they can bring the new one up. You have to have regulatory and safety compliance complete. So there's that CCC is a China regional certification that you have to have. They've got to move all the equipment. We've got to qualify from a process control standpoint and product performance. Everything at the new site has to work at least as well as the old site. So if we have a 98% yield at the old site, I want 98 or better. And all this has to be invisible to the customer. You can't impact a carrier, so T-Mobile, AT&T, anyone we're selling to, they shouldn't even know this occurred. So it has to be invisible to your customer. So that's part of the management. So when you're going through manufacturing cycles, those are some of the things that we actively manage with them. Talk a little bit about quality. At least within the electronics industry, in my experience, is the tier one. So tier one are kind of the direct suppliers. Tier one, from my experience, tend to be pretty much on par with US counterparts. So they have certifications like ISO 9000, TL, which is a telecommunications, ISO 14000 is environmental compliance. They can do clean rooms, they can do ESD control, they know how to do statistical process control. Pretty much anything, you will find an equivalent to a US counterpart. At the tier 2 level, so the suppliers to the manufacturing, so the people a little further down the food chain, it'll depend. There are some very good ones and some not so good ones. You have to do your due diligence to find out which one you have and which ones they're using, which is important. And then what's enabled that? To be honest, Western firms are, to some extent, are really enabling China's, some of the success there. So for an Apple or a Motorola or an HP, whichever, for us to do manufacturing there, right, we want to make sure they're up to our standards so the products you get, we get, I get, meet our expectations. Well, that means training them in many cases and enforcing that they use good techniques, controls, equipment. But over time, that becomes embedded. Okay, one of the things that's at least topical for me that I wanted to share is one of the things to consider with China is, or the quote, how many eggs do you want to put in that basket? So China's a big country, but there's been a couple things that have happened recently. Actually, there's one even more recent than this, but in March, we had an earthquake and a tsunami in Japan, right? So, all right, it's not in China, but that was actually a big deal. I'll take one specific example. So one of the parts, a key part in electronics, is a capacitor, right? Very basic part. It's paper / foil, a little gel wrapped around a wire. None of your electronics will work without capacitors. Every single one, every electronic device you have has at least one of those in there. Most of those are made in Japan. Most of those became unavailable very suddenly when the tsunami hit. So what did that do? Well, a lot of firms, automotive, electronic, had to go figure out how they were going to make capacitors or get capacitors. So everybody who had all their eggs in that basket was in trouble all of a sudden. Well, actually, this helped China because China has a few firms that started getting into capacitors. They did very well at the end of Q1 and Q2, becoming a second source for everybody on how to make capacitors, which make everything else. So from a China standpoint, people diversifying risk for Japan will probably help China, because some of the manufacturing will shift to there. An opposite example, which is a few years ago, but in 2008 we had an avian bird flu. Well, that put a big kibosh on travel, put a bunch of restrictions in place. That could very well happen to China, and actually had an impact on China for in terms of people going in and out, right? So that engineering information we talked about, it wasn't easy. It was hard to get in and out of China. There was extra restrictions. Not everybody could go. Not everybody even wanted to go. So one of the things you have to consider as part of risk mitigation, or from a corporate standpoint, is how much supply do you want in one spot or one geography that could be subject to, whatever geopolitical or environmental factors. All right, and is China going to stay the go-to spot for manufacturing? So I said early on it became the #1 manufacturing site. Is it going to continue to be that? Well, there's a number of factors, and I've shown up here, so you see India. India is another competitor to China from a country standpoint. Vietnam is on many people's radar screens as a manufacturing alternate. So what's going to help determine that? Well, wages. So as wages and inflation goes up in China, that becomes a factor. Logistics and infrastructure are a big deal. So how easy is it to do business, build, and ship? China is really easy. Their government is very, very pro-business, I would say, on the whole. It's very easy to do manufacturing, to ship, to do things in China on the whole. They're probably one of the easiest places to do it in. India is comparatively much harder. It's being able just to get through the roads, get through all the little different local regulations in India is just much harder than it is in China. It's actually cheaper in India from a wage standpoint than it is in China, but it's harder in India, which ties into the government. And then last is you have some tariffs and local tax laws that actually can make a huge difference. So Brazil, European Union, South Africa, there's a number of countries that have local content laws or incentives, shall we say. A lot of products are fairly thin on margin, so the amount of profit a company makes on a given product may not be very large. So Brazil, for example, I think has like a 20% tariff. Well, if you're importing the goods, they put a 20% tax on it. Well, that makes it very expensive. So it's worth a fair amount of effort to figure out how to make things locally in a place like Brazil. They do an economic analysis. They look at wages, they look at tax rates, they look at incentives. The land is often given or rented, right, or subleased. So they look at the total economic package, and they look at the supply. So who would they buy from? Actually, universities are part of the equation. So one of the things that they look at and we look at is you need skilled labor, right? So you need people to assemble, but you also need technicians, you need engineers, you need managers, right? You need people with skills to run that factory. So is there a labor pool both at a assembly level and at a manager technical level in the area? So they look at that and they make a pick or recommendation, and then they go tell their customer their proposal, and we reach an agreement. I'm sure they had some strings attached to any incentive package that they might have given. So there's typically a expectation of, we'll tell you, I mean, right? So we're trying to hire however many thousands of people, and that's just our company. There's other companies that are going to be at that site. So typically the local population, the local area will get tapped first before they start going further afield. So that would be common. I don't know if there's a specific legal contractual requirement that exists for it. But there I would say there's at least an expectation of that. We do have engineering teams that are located in China. We have a significant engineering team in Beijing. The Tianjin Center has engineering resources associated with it. So yeah, absolutely, there's R&D and engineering, product engineering that is done local in China, for sure. It's not the only place, but there is an element of that. I mean, just kind of for everyone's level set, there are technology restrictions of what you're allowed to export for technology. Typically, cell phones don't get to that level. There's certain encryption. When Motorola, I don't know if everyone knows, Motorola split into two companies last year. There's one side of the group does government and public safety, so kind of radios for fire, police, FBI. Those have some higher encryption functions. Some of those things are not exportable. Some of those, there's specific technology. So all that, within those boundaries, you have to follow the legal requirements. So there's certain technologies you can't export. But yes, we do absolutely do R&D there. Most of them are single. They always have the option. They don't have to live there, but they are provided accommodations there. They can live off-site, but they have to make arrangements then, is my understanding of it. So it's not a requirement. It's kind of an option. I think it would be equivalent to here. So there's dorms. You can live in the dorm. You don't have to live in the dorm. But then you got to make your own arrangement if you don't live in the dorm. Clarify. So we communicate with customers in terms of telling them our intentions. So we're going to move from site A to site B. We'll tell them the time frame. So we communicate with them. But it's invisible from a standpoint of if you ordered 10,000 units to arrive on November 15th, we're not going to give you an excuse why it's going to be 2 weeks late. You should expect the same degree of service. So from that standpoint, they shouldn't see any difference. Every phone, the phone we built at the last phone we built at the last site and the first phone we built at the next site, if you put them side by side, you shouldn't be able to tell them apart. A blue there is the same as a blue in the other site, so they don't look different. They don't act differently. The software works the same. So invisible from the standpoint of, from them worrying about it, it should be invisible from a practical standpoint. We tell them about it, but from does it impact their business? You don't want to impact their business. So from a Six Sigma standpoint, so it depends. But companies in China have Six Sigma methodologies. They have green belts, they have black belts. They are doing statistical process control techniques to a similar extent that equivalent companies in the US would do. So it depends whether they're Six Sigma and what aspect is Six Sigma, but they're using the intent there was the techniques that they're using. I don't know the direct comparison. It'll depend on different technologies operate. So it depends on what technology you're referring to. But like silicone, like if you're making ICs, those tend to be, from a process control standpoint, they tend to be very high, 5, 6, 7, right, 8. They tend to have to be very good, and they tend to be highly automated. Because labor is, again, we're going to shift gears, but assembly operations, so for example, because labor is much cheaper in China, the amount of automation is less. So in the US, you would have typically a little more automation because the labor is expensive. So it's cheaper to automate portions of it to a higher degree than you would in a China factory. There are, so one of them is time. So it's actually, it adds a day. So from Nanning versus the Shenzhen site adds a day to the logistics. So it's a truck, you add about an 8-hour truck ride from Nanning to the coastal port. So you're adding at least a day. The freight of the truck is not that big from a China, but you're adding a day of inventory, a day of logistics. So now you have to get it to the port, and then you put it on the boat, and then you head out. So the larger impact actually is the cycle time. You have to add a day of cycle time to it. Number of things that they did. So one is actually they actually put in nets, like around the top, which is a kind of a physical barrier, but it's also a mental barrier to some extent. They increased wages, right? So one of the things is part of that 14% annual, but they bumped the wages up, so they improved the compensation. So hopefully that kind of relieves some of the pressure. And they also went through, and I'll have to defer to some of their press releases, but they also did classroom training, and they did sessions. So Motorola is part of an industry group that looks at electronic industry standards. So we're part of that, and so that sets a kind of an overall, not governance, but overall governance. And then we do go in, Motorola has an audit process where we go through and we audit, not every supplier, but certainly a Foxhound, where we go through and we'll do an audit of their compliance to like child labor laws are one of them. So we'll go through and we'll do audits of those functions at some of the different sites. And when we go to a new supplier, that's part of our new supplier sign-off sheet. So we like checklists. But we go through and say, okay, do they comply with, right? People are right, they have to be of age, they have to have the right. Consequences for non-compliance. So if it's noted, it's escalated. Can go up to their CEO. It depends the severity of it, and they have to put an action plan in place, and they have to demonstrate it's corrected. What Motorola can do is either we'll either reduce or eliminate our business, and if it's ethical or legal, I mean we certainly will follow the legal requirements of the country we're in. Second tier supplier, so any supplier we pick, sometimes we actually go down 2 or 3 levels. Any supplier we pick, we go through a similar audit process for. If it's a supplier kind of outside of our line of visibility, we're not able to audit those, but we do ask that, one of the things we look for is that they have a similar process, so that they have a similar. It doesn't have to be the same. That's kind of not within our purview, but they have a similar process. We're moving to some new sites. A lot of that move actually is being driven because there's a lack of availability of labor. So I would say that the labor companies are moving inland. Part of it is to some extent chasing lower cost labor, but part of it is because a lot of the available labor in the coastal regions has basically been consumed or absorbed. So I would say it's making, so there's labor availability further inland. I don't see that I haven't done a study on it, but I don't expect to see a significant negative impact in the Shenzhen or other areas, at least not in the short term. Some of the things that are done in the U.S. So a lot of the engineering there's still a significant amount of engineering that's done in the U.S. Some of the reasons for that is alignment with the customer base. So what people are looking for here and the kind of the nuances of what a U.S. consumer might want or is marketable is still tied in the design part is tied within the U.S. So those portions, the intellectual property design aspects tend to be more U.S. centric. Some of the governance in terms of corporate functions tend to be U.S. centric. Procurement tends to be mixed, so there are some people who buy parts or work with suppliers who are China-based, but some are in the U.S. A lot of the big, like silicone, a lot of the big headquarters or where decisions are made are in the U.S., so you have to be located with that, and you need to be by your customers. So if your primary customers are AT&Ts and T-Mobiles and Verizons, and the market you're selling a significant amount is U.S. based, and you're going to have some sales and other alignment with your customer base. It's early on right now, but I'll give you for a Shenzhen example. Apple has a building or two, so they have buildings there. We have a building. There's a number of firms that are within the same campus. So you will absolutely see competitive firms, U.S. firms that are compete with each other within the same company footprint. I would say that there's competition between different geographic sites within China to become a multinational host facility. Because one of the things I had put up there is it's not just the manufacturing site, but think about a bigger circle of, if I'm building phones, I need plastic molding to put the plastic pieces together. I need to make connectors. I need little pieces and parts. Some of those it's easier to do locally, where you can do it quickly, relatively, and efficiently. So you tend to build up campuses. So to some extent, I think the geography, cities, there's some competition to get enough critical mass where you get multinationals and the tier 2 suppliers and the tier 3 suppliers all setting up shop within a geography. So you tend to need a critical mass. That's actually one of the things Vietnam hasn't quite hit that threshold yet. They have some good wages and there's some good small campuses, but the concerns have tended to be they don't have the periphery. They haven't hit critical mass yet to say, okay, they've got another dozen tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers ringing the main site yet. They may well get there, but they're not there yet. I think that's been for the last 3 years. I think actually the last year is actually a little higher than that, but it's about the last 3 years. I'm not sure how long it's sustainable. That's actually one of the things that's one of the concerns that's actually driving people to move. So if people, you don't know the future, right? But if you knew that was going to level out and cap off, well, then your incentive to move stuff is lower. If that is going to go up to 20 or 25%, then you have more incentive. So I can't predict that, but there is a concern that is going to continue. So if you start at $1 an hour, right, 14% increase, you're at $1.14, right, 30, right? So you can take bigger percentage increases if you start at a lower number. China is still one of the cheaper places to do manufacturing. It's not the cheapest, but it's one of the cheaper places. India is actually a little bit less. Again, there's other challenges in India other than the straight wage rate, but India is a little bit cheaper. I don't remember the Vietnam number off the top of my head. I think they're close. They might be slightly less. But it's one of the top ones. Again, they've got some critical mass has been one of their advantages. But it is one of the, for one of that scale, it's certainly very highly competitive. Yeah, it assumes level production. So if we were going to build 100,000 units at the old site, we're going to build 100,000 at the new site. If the volumes shift significantly, you're right, that equation doesn't work. But typically, you normalizing for volume. Actually, an interesting point is today, believe it or not, freight costs outweigh labor costs, at least on many of the devices. So you actually pay more to ship the thing than it costs to put it together. So you can see where you end up with a tipping point of how much does it cost to put an electronic device together versus how much does it cost to ship it. So you might have, right, so if you've got 50 cents of labor and it costs you 60 cents to ship it, okay, but if you build it somewhere else, it costs you $1, and you could, right, so you have to look at the total, you have to look at your equation. But in many cases, or in some cases at least, freight costs and manufacturing costs are on par. So it's actually the amount that you're paying for freight is getting close or exceeding, especially as, right, fuel prices are volatile, so you'll see rapid changes in that. So it's an exciting dynamic. It's certainly not a dead field. So Motorola has been doing some hopefully good innovation, but has been coming out with a number of key, good devices. So please take a look at the Razr out there. We think it's actually would be a good device for you. So there's some devices like that. We do have a pending acquisition by Google. One of the things Google brings to the table, so they own the Android operating system, but it's really an important part of having I call it an ecosystem. So people don't just buy devices anymore, right? So you have a phone, but you want your phone to do a bunch of things, right? You want to be able to use a map. You want it to be able to navigate for you. You might want to have your Facebook page on it. You might want to, you do music on it. You take pictures with it, right? It has a lot of functions. One of the things, and I think that's actually one of the, advantage going forward is as Google and Motorola, increase that partnership, is that overall ecosystem will continue to get stronger and to grow. I think that's actually, I think the Android, I don't remember the last number, I think the Android platform is actually just roughly the same size, or maybe just was slightly bigger than the Apple overall, not Motorola specifically, but between the whole Android platform is about the same size as Apple is. So, that ability to do multiple things from a device is an important part. And honestly, that's one of the things Apple does well, to be honest with you. I won't badmouth Apple. They do that pretty well, right? So being able to take music, integrate, their ecosystem, they did a good job with their ecosystem, in fairness. What else does Motorola do? So we've talked a lot about phones. One of the things Motorola is looking at beyond just phones is, call it a 3-screen strategy, but you've got your TV at home, you've got laptop, and you've got a phone. So you got 3 different screens of information. But as we go forward, there's going to be a lot of synergy between all 3 of those devices, right? So you want to be able to take a video at home, be able to move it easily to your phone, to your laptop, be able to move things around, take something off your phone, right? Kind of flip it up on the screen, being able to move things back and forth. Motorola is one of the companies that's actually in all those spaces to be able to do be able to do the video content is into phones, can do the networking in between. So a lot of that system architecture, being able to do that, I think that's also within from a competitive standpoint, is a place where Motorola has an opportunity at least. Hopefully we can execute well with it. No, I couldn't comment on that. Some of them are part of that same industrial electronics association. So if the ones that are part of that would be part of that same level of expectation, but I couldn't comment specifically. As far as other consumer products, there are some. So well, actually, probably the best one is if you have a Bluetooth headphone, right? So that Motorola actually makes quite a few of those. There are no immediate plans for, I guess, expansion into, vastly different, but, right? So we've got, actually, some of the market's actually evolving very fast. So some of that's, it's going to be hard to say. So you've got smartphones, there's tablets. Tablets has become an evolving market. E-readers and tablets are going to be very hard to tell apart probably in a year or so, right? What's the difference between an e-reader and a tablet? It's kind of how you want to market it and what you want to sell it for. They're not really that different of devices. Those are all starting to, if you look at the Motorola Atrix product, so if I take my cell phone and I plug it into a docking station, now I have a laptop. So you can see a lot of these technologies merging where, my phone has a good enough processor in it that I can plug it into a docking station and it's a laptop. And I can take it back out and use it as a cell phone and carry it around, or I can do video on it, right? So I think the Razr 2 has a dual core processor in it. So that's it's not quite up to the cutting edge laptop standards, but it's not too far off. I think a new laptop might have a quad core in it. So all those technologies are kind of merging.